Hey, thank you everyone for joining from wherever you are. Obviously these are strange times, and I'm glad that we're still being reminded that women's rights still matter. And as I hope we've learned, if we let our guards down, even for a moment, things can slip away more quickly than we think. So big thanks also to the Women's Human Rights Campaign for organizing this panel and including me. I think the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights is an incredibly important document. I think we all need to be reminded regularly that women do have sex-based rights. It seems many have completely forgotten this. And ensure that women are not discriminated against due to having been born female, not due to whether or not they were born with an affinity towards high heels. So by now, you know, like I've traveled a lot over the past year to do various speaking events and panels. So I've talked to women all around the world, and usually what they say is like, what happened in Canada? You know, I think that people around the world, especially people who are really involved in this debate and feminists, see Canada as the place that really jumped down this gender identity rabbit hole first and fastest, and with a great deal of enthusiasm, giving feminists in other parts of the world a bit of a warning in the process, which I guess was useful for the rest of you, not so useful for us. But luckily for places like the UK and Scotland, women were able to see what happens if you don't organize and push back. So women did organize and push back there, which has been incredible to watch. But unfortunately in Canada, we failed big time, and it's hard for me to conceal my disappointment in Canadians, I have to say. So what happened in Canada was that in 2016, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who at the time was the Minister of Justice in Justin Trudeau's Liberal cabinet, introduced Bill C-16. So a woman, a feminist, this is a politician who would have otherwise ticked all the intersectional feminist progressive boxes for many progressives and feminists in Canada. I think probably a lot of feminists throughout Canada supported her and still do support her. What we should have learned by now is that those who share many of our political positions or who fit into the appropriate diversity boxes, who fit appropriately on the left, those who fit the mold of what we've decided our allies are or should be are often not so. I think in many ways we're still in denial about that. I know that it's a hard pill to swallow, but this is the reality we're dealing with, so we need to get real. And too many feminists continue to stubbornly and, you know, kind of desperately, again, which is understandable, cling to the left, a left that has demonstrated cowardice time and time again when it comes to standing up for women. So on May 17th, 2016, Jody Wilson-Raybould introduced Bill C-16, which was an act to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code in the House of Commons. The bill was intended to protect individuals from discrimination within the sphere of federal jurisdiction and for being the targets of hate propaganda as a consequence of their gender identity or gender expression. The bill also added gender identity or expression to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act and the list of characteristics of identifiable groups protected from hate propaganda in the Criminal Code. What it really did, though, I mean, it was a really unclear bill, and the result was not actually a material change in legislation, but the effect was almost immediate and widespread across Canada from province to province. And what it really did was to legitimize the concept of gender identity itself as a real thing. You know, now this is a protected group of people. So these people are apparently definable and identifiable. Of course, they're not. You know, gender identity remains a completely vague category that really could include any one of us. So, you know, I don't, there's no such thing as gender identity. I don't believe that. I'm sure many of you watching don't believe that. You know, there's having a personality, there's having likes and dislikes, that's all there is. So including gender identity in the Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code also emboldened trans activists to accuse those who disagreed with the idea of gender identity, like myself, of hate speech and even of criminal acts. So it's not uncommon to be told, for example, that in Canada, it's illegal to misgender or to insist that trans women are in fact male. This isn't technically true yet, but we do really need to stay on top of this to ensure such a thing does not come to fruition. You know, we'll find out how this goes and what the law actually is if there's ever a lawsuit of this nature. So at the time, back in 2016, when the bill was introduced, few were even aware that it had been introduced at all. It really slid in under the radar. There was very little media coverage. There was no public debate. And by the time a few of us caught wind, the bill was really already on its way. So, you know, I knew that I needed to speak up. As far as I could tell, no one else was speaking up publicly. I'm a writer, so this is what I can do. This is what I'm capable of doing. This is what I'm capable of contributing. And I, you know, I really just wanted to start this conversation. So I pitched every editor that I knew in Canada. I mean, the Canadian media landscape is very small. So unfortunately, there's not a ton of options, and the options that are available are obviously not great. Canadians are rather cowardly in general, and that's also applicable to the news media, unfortunately. So I did finally convince one editor I had worked with at a local online newspaper called the Vancouver Observer to publish my op-ed about the bill and its impact on women and girls. And, you know, at this point, by the time I published this article, it was October 2016. The bill had already passed 2 readings at the House of Commons, and the only other person in Canada who had spoken out about concerns at this point was Jordan Peterson, who said, you know, his points were good and valid, but, you know, he had nothing to say about the potential impact on women and women's rights. And rather, his focus was about compelled speech and the possibility of being forced to use preferred pronouns. You know, women in Canada were being silenced for sure. I've been silenced in Canada by the media intentionally for several years now. But at the same time, no one was doing anything, and no one was organizing, and no one was speaking out. And so this bill passed with almost no pushback. I was almost on my own, and I was treated as though I was on my own also. So, you know, trans activists in Canada could easily pretend as though I was the only person in all of Canada who was talking about this. And I was just like some lone hateful bigot who didn't want trans-identified people to have any rights, which is not true, of course. So in May 2017, I was invited to testify at the Canadian Senate against Bill C-16. And I suggested to the senator who invited me that he also invite Hilla Kerner, who's a collective member at Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter. And when I put forward my case at the Senate, I didn't even talk about trans-identified people. I talked about women and women's rights. I talked about gender and what masculinity and femininity mean under patriarchy particularly. I explained that, you know, how women feel on the inside doesn't protect them from sexist treatment or from male violence. I said that women's rights were being pushed aside to accommodate a trend. And I didn't, you know, I wasn't so naive to think that my words would stop this bill from passing. But I did want it to be on record that someone spoke out, and that, you know, specifically somebody warned that gender identity legislation and policy could harm women and girls, and it has, just as we predicted, and, you know, possibly even worse. And I think that it will continue to get worse before it starts to get better. So I really, I mean, I talk about this all the time, but I really can't hide my disappointment in Canadians. I can't hide my anger at how awful the media has been on this, who intentionally declined to do their jobs, erasing women, erasing the fact that a feminist analysis of this even existed, totally throwing women under the bus, reporting on gender identity in a completely biased way, pretending there was no debate to be had between the, good progressive people who believe it's possible for a man to declare himself female, or who think that it's helpful to put kids on puberty blockers if they don't feel comfortable with the gender roles assigned to them, versus the bad, hateful bigots who believe in material reality and telling the truth. It's hard for me to hide my anger at friends and even feminists in Canada who said nothing for fear of upsetting their friends or their political allies. We really screwed up, and we're now paying the price. And only now are some very brave women in Canada organizing, but still, most people in this country are doing nothing because they would prefer to avoid conflict instead of standing up, which to me seems like a appalling trade-off, to lose women's rights because you don't want to have a difficult conversation, and because your friends might get mad at you. So I find too many people are choosing to fret privately or vent at me over text, but still refuse to take action. And I've completely lost faith in Canadian media and in the left. I mean, if we all lose our rights, we all lose. No woman who has gone public speaking out about this issue, speaking out about gender identity and policy, is safe. It's not any more or less risky for anyone. We all take risks when we do this work and we speak out. And I don't buy those excuses that says, oh, it's too hard for me. I might lose my job, I might lose my friends, so on and so forth. We all lose in those ways. We all get threats. This is a dangerous thing to speak out about, but this is what it means to be a feminist. It doesn't mean playing it safe. It means being courageous and doing what you feel is right, even when it's hard, even when it's risky, even when it's scary. Doesn't mean tweeting anonymously on Twitter about how, other women who are public are doing it wrong, which I see happening far too often these days, unfortunately. So, tons and tons of women throughout the world have been brave in this fight. As I've said many times, I'm so impressed with the organizing that's happened in the UK and Scotland. It's really inspiring. So I hope that people turn to those groups and those women for inspiration. All of these women deserve our respect, our admiration, and our support. And even, you don't have to do something big, right? You can do a lot of small things to contribute, and you don't have to do one particular thing. There's a million different ways that you can make a difference. You do what you can do. Not everyone wants to go to a protest. Not everyone is a public speaker. Not everyone is a writer. Some people are better at organizing from behind the scenes. You can write a petition. You can have a meeting with your MP. You can write a letter. You can talk to your union. So all of the women who are doing these things, I want to say, matter. It doesn't have to be one thing. It doesn't have to be, posting publicly on Facebook. You can do other work. You can talk to your friends. You can donate to a women's group who is organizing around this issue and support them. You can speak out in support of another woman who's under attack due to her role in the fight against gender identity legislation and in support of women's rights. I think that diversity of tactics is a good thing, and I'm tired of watching women who do something, who do take action, being kind of clawed at and torn down or criticized for doing it wrong. Because my perspective is that, if you don't like what one woman is doing in this fight, then you should do something different. There's all sorts of ways to go about this, and all of those ways are important. So what we did in Vancouver, I do want to shout out a couple of women in Vancouver who really made a massive difference in terms of forcing the conversation to happen in Canada. So we held the first ever event discussing the issue of gender identity and women's rights in Vancouver at the Vancouver Public Library in January of 2019. And that event was organized by two women, Holly Stamer and Amy Ham. And these were just regular women who were angry about this issue. You know, this is how feminism happens. It's just regular women. They're not credentialed women. You don't have to be like a long time experienced activist. Amy and Holly were just, they're angry about this issue. They're angry that women were being silenced. They were angry that I was being silenced in Canada, where I live and where I've worked as a feminist and a leftist in the fight for women's rights for some time. And they wanted to have a public conversation about these issues. And we can't wait around for someone else to do this for us. We have to do it ourselves. Women have always had to do it themselves. So, they just wanted to do something. So they did, despite the risks and consequences. They worry about losing their jobs. Also, they worry about losing friends. They worry about threats. They worry about all these things. It's not easy for anyone. And these are the women that we need in this movement. Women who are just going to take action. Women who may or may not fit the politically pure mold, who may not know all the right, jargon, women who tell the truth, women who are authentic, who care about women, who are willing to take action and speak out. So since then, they've organized two more events in Vancouver. One was a panel about gender identity and kids, and another was looking at gender identity in the media. I was on all those panels as well as some other people. A third event looking at cancel culture and movement building is going to take place online on Friday, May 15th. And a fourth event was planned for March, which was looking at women's spaces, women's sports, and women's prisons. We had to postpone due to coronavirus, but we hope to get that going online soon. The media almost wholly refused to cover any of these events. They were sort of forced. They wanted to just pretend it wasn't happening at all, but they were forced to do some coverage because of the protests and the efforts to shut down all of these events. But most of that coverage was centered around the protests, not the actual words of the panelists involved in the events, which is continually frustrating. The CBC, which is our national public broadcaster here in Canada, for example, had a radio panel about our first event at the Vancouver Public Library about the issue of free speech, and invited a local trans activist and a lawyer to talk about what I might say at the event and whether or not the words I imagine I might say might constitute hate speech, but they never contacted me for comment or included me on the panel. The CBC didn't even show up to the actual event, even though they're right across the street from the library. And to date, the CBC in my city in Vancouver, where I live, has never contacted me for comment on this issue. They don't speak to feminists about this issue at all. They're promoting an entirely false narrative around gender identity intentionally, and it is shameful. And we're all funding them. The second event addressing the issue of trans kids, featured a panel including myself, a young detransitioned woman from the States, Dagny, and Dr. Ken Zucker, who ran the Gender Identity Clinic in Toronto for over 2 decades before being fired as a result of a smear campaign by trans activists. Nothing hateful was said at this event. Nothing hateful has been said at any of our events, of course. 260 people attended that one about trans kids, and it was protested by somewhere between like 150 and 200 trans activists, some of whom said we had blood on our hands. And we sent out a press release to every media outlet we could think of prior to the event. And again, the media entirely ignored the whole thing. The best coverage of this issue in Canada came after I spoke to a relatively small crowd of about 100 people, mostly women, in Toronto in November. And the event was organized by a Toronto-based group called Radical Feminists Unite. And it took place at the Toronto Public Library, basically because every other venue they approached refused to accommodate them because they didn't want to get involved in something so controversial as a talk discussing the fact that females exist. So that event was protested by hundreds of people. One of the cops told me that there were 700 people outside at one point. It was quite scary to watch. I don't know if any of you saw the footage, but these people were very angry. Some of them were screaming misogynist things in the faces of women trying to attend the event. Antifa was there. And all this was done, of course, in order to demonstrate how open-minded, inclusive, and empathetic they are. Prior to the event, thousands of Canadians signed on to a petition demanding the Toronto Public Library cancel the booking, but the chief librarian, Vickery Bowles, refused to cave, insisting she would always stand up for free speech, saying this is a hill to die on. And so finally, the media began to pay attention, and a few Toronto journalists even spoke out in my defense and in defense of the library's decision to allow the event to go on. To this day, supposed progressives, feminists, members of the literary community in Canada, even people who work for the public library, that is to say, people who should be very invested in free speech and free expression, continue to insist I should have been silenced. And you know, that the Toronto Public Library and the Vancouver Public Library should be punished for upholding their mandates. And in fact, they have been published and banned from Pride, for example, simply for really doing their job. So Canada has apparently regressed into a state that pretends that supporting women's rights and upholding free speech is oppressive, whereas silencing women and authoritarianism and vicious, misogynist bullying is progressive. One example of this is in Vancouver, there's a group called Coalition Against Trans Antagonism, CATA, and those members have openly threatened violence against the panelists and attendees of hosts of our events here in Vancouver. You know, they plastered posters of my face all over Vancouver. And yet many local leftists here continue to support them or just don't speak out about these overt threats of male violence against women. This is the group that I'm fairly certain is responsible for vandalizing Vancouver Rape Relief, writing "Die TERFs" on the storefront of a space for abused women and shoving disemboweled animals in their mail slot. And, you know, this group's ongoing behavior seems to me to verge on terrorism. But of course, I've heard nothing from politicians and authorities about CATA's activities, never mind feminist and leftist groups in Vancouver. The media, namely the CBC, has even interviewed CATA members as though they're, you know, legitimate human rights activists and not a group of miscreants who openly threaten women with death. So none of the supposedly brave activists in Vancouver claiming to fight for the most marginalized and the most oppressed will stand up for the most marginalized and most oppressed: abused women, prostituted women, poor women, women fighting for their lives. And yet they have the nerve to position themselves as being on the right side of history. History will not be kind to these traitors and liars and cowards, I promise. In Canada, of course, we also saw a predatorial, violent man file 16 human rights complaints against local estheticians, many of whom were immigrants, and none of whom had any particular power or privilege in this world, except, of course, under gender identity ideology, wherein now all women, even the poor, even the racialized, even the exploited, even the abused, have cis privilege, which means that a perverted, violent man can accuse women of oppressing him by declining to handle his female penis. And where are all these brave activists, these social justice warriors? They're silent. I mean, surely that's how you want your historic legacy to be recorded as an activist. An abused man tried to destroy the lives of marginalized women, and I stayed silent because I was worried about what my friends might think. So this man, Jonathan, now Jessica Yaniv, who filed these human rights complaints, lost, thank goodness. And he was made to pay damages to the respondents. But have laws or policies been revised? Have those advocating gender identity legislation and ideology recanted or admitted that maybe turning the idea that a man can literally become a woman purely through announcement into law could be harmful to women? Have they admitted complicity? Have politicians and lawmakers reconsidered Bill C-16, considering the very real consequences they were warned about? Of course not. Of course, we in Canada, the very progressive, very polite, very inclusive Canada, are continuing to be so open-minded that women have lost the ability to say no. No, you may not take my rights. No, you may not access this change room where women and girls are present. No, you may not be transferred to a female prison where you may sexually harass and abuse female prisoners, possibly the most marginalized population in Canada, actually. No, you may not compete in a sports competition against women because you are a man. We have lost the ability to name material reality and to state the truth. And still, there are excuses. I can't speak up, I'll lose my friends, I'll lose my job, my family will be angry, I don't like conflict. No more excuses. Your comfort is not more important than all of our rights. I cannot believe that anybody would watch as all the brave women who came before us, who fought and suffered for our rights, as all of that is lost right before our eyes, and then claim, no, I can't possibly speak out, it can't be me. It has to be you. In March of last year, Vancouver city councillors, Vancouver is just an incredible place. Vancouver city councillors threatened to cut funding to Canada's longest standing rape crisis center and transition house, which is Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter, if they didn't change their women-only policy. This happened after a few local trans activists, namely Maureen O'Hara, who at the time was BC NDP vice president, he is no longer, as well as members of CATA, complained that the organization didn't allow men to train to become counselors at the transition house, or that they didn't house male victims of violence. This was challenged by Vancouver Rape Relief and a bunch of Vancouver Rape Relief allies who fought the city to reconsider this decision, but this year in February, the city voted unanimously to pull funding because of their women-only policy, which is, for the record, well within their rights. Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter won the right to determine their own membership and who they serve, both at the provincial Supreme Court and at the federal level in 2007. All oppressed groups have this right. It wasn't a decision that was specific to women. Maureen O'Hara has attempted to claim over and over again that what groups like Vancouver Rape Relief are doing is against the law in Canada, but that's not actually true. Yeah, so there are now some groups who are organizing, within the past year. We now have groups like Cause Bar, which is Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights. They have a great website that you should go check out. There's PDF Quebec, there's We the Females, there's Radical Feminists Unite, again, who organized the Toronto event. There's now the Vancouver Ad Hoc Committee of Women for Women, there's a Lesbian Collective, and GIDYVR, which stands for Gender Identity and Vancouver's airport code, YVR, is our group here in Vancouver. Amy and Holly have been so great organizing all these events here. So, you know, these groups have been responsible for forcing a conversation that wasn't happening before, but unfortunately we are pretty far down the rabbit hole.
How to push back given the institutional capture. Sometimes I do get really pessimistic and think that it may be too late. And sometimes I think that perhaps if we just like wait as we waited with forced sterilizations in South America or in India, that it was financed by the World Bank, and maybe like, okay, the world will notice someday that this was an insane thing to do, and then everything will change, right? But then I'm seeing Scotland and the UK pushing back, and then I think, okay, in Mexico, this is fairly newish, and so it may not be too late. However, we are dealing with institutional capture, so the National Women's Institution is in on it, the Anti-Discrimination Bureau is in on it, the big shot NGOs are in on it. However, we're still mostly a conservative country, so there is some balance to it. But at the same time, we're also dealing not only with cancel culture and doxing and threats to radical feminists. We're all used to this, but in Mexico, we have the added challenge of like extreme violence towards women and feminists. So my question would be like, yeah, how to push back given this context, and what would a political opportunity would look like in this context?
I mean, I think that it's best to try to not be out there on your own. So I think, I mean, it takes, you know, 3 people to form a group. And then once you have a group, then that's something other women can access, and inevitably women will want to join on. I think that what I hear from talking to so many women around the world, and again, you know, when I do talks and panels, is, you know, pretty much every time at least one woman afterwards will be like, I don't know what to do. Like, I'm so desperate to do something, but where I live, I'm the only feminist, or I'm the only person there I know who thinks like this. And, you know, how can I do something? But what also happens at these events, and this is one of the great things about doing events, is that it really contributes to movement building. So, you know, this one woman will stand up and then say, you know, like, does anybody just like want to have a meeting with me or start a group or organize an action? And then another woman in the room, or more than one woman, will stand up and say yes, and then they plan something. So I think, you know, the first thing to do is just start, even if you just know one other woman, just start something and sort of put yourselves out there so that women have something that they feel like they can do and they can contribute to. And like I said, there's many, many different ways to contribute. We don't all have to be, you know, on a megaphone shouting to a bunch of people. That works for some people, not others. And, you know, I feel like, you know, what the Scottish women did was great, because they were meeting with politicians and lobbying politicians for a year before they even went public. So they already had all these allies, and they had explained the issues to all these politicians also. So, you know, they knew that they had support, and, you know, that's something that isn't so scary to do. You know, just set up a meeting. You have the right to do that. Set up a meeting with your local MP or whatever it is, wherever you are, and write letters. I mean, for a lot of people in the world, I think I forget all the time, that a lot of people in the world, a lot of people in Canada don't even know anything about this. Like, this is all we talk about. So we think that everyone knows like what's going on. But if you bring it up, if you bring up any of this stuff to a lot of regular people, they'll be like, wait, what? Like, men in women's prisons? Like, what, Rachel McKinnon is a man? Like, what are you talking? This is crazy. You're joking, right? So people still need to be educated.
Yeah. My question is relates to the initial part of your presentation where you mentioned that women have sex-based rights. I did a review of all the human rights codes in Canada, in the various provinces and federally. And I saw, you know, there's protections for women. Some of them define it based on sex. Some of it say gender. Some of them have a weird mishmash of gender identity, sex, and gender expression. And some, like Ontario, say, to be clear, if you provide separated spaces for women, for, you know, sex-based, for reasons of public decency, that's not discriminatory. So it seems to me like all I can find is sex-based protections. I'm wondering if you're aware of any sex-based rights or any case law that can, you know, that advances this idea of sex-based, like, positive rights.
Well, women did, you know, one example that I mean, you have the right not to be discriminated against if you get pregnant in the workplace. You have the right not to be fired because you get pregnant. So that's a sex-based right. In Canada, you know, for example, female firefighters fought to have their own locker rooms and change rooms, like places to shower, because women are obviously a minority in that workplace, and they were experiencing sexual harassment and abuse in those workplaces. So that's also a sex-based right, the right to have your own space. Although, of course, that, you know, that happened very recently, and now we've sort of almost immediately lost that right again. But you're right. I mean, it is vague. But I mean, we are explicitly protected from sexism and sexual harassment in the workplace, and, you know, again, being discriminated against and fired for things that are specifically related to our being female.
I think that one of the challenges is that you've got the trans people who have a transgender identity saying, on the one hand, look, you're hurting us actively by excluding us from women's spaces, and the answer for female-bodied people, it would have to be based on profiling. You know, like, we want men as a group outside of our space. I think that that's the challenge, is that at least in Canada, this idea of profiling is completely unacceptable. Just had any comments?
I mean, it's true, like, somehow trans activists have argued that being excluded from women's spaces endangers them and puts them at risk of violence, and there's no conversation, except for the feminists who argue this, around the fact that actually it's men in women's spaces that cause a danger or present a danger to women in certain spaces. Again, not in all spaces, spaces where women are particularly vulnerable, change rooms, prisons, etc. I mean, yeah, I don't know what to tell you, because we have lost all those rights, and nobody will have that conversation, not the authorities, not institutions, not, you know, the school board, not, you know, the community centers, which have turned all of their change rooms and bathrooms into gender neutral spaces. So there's signs posted everywhere. If you go to the pool or you go to the gym or whatever, trans people are welcome, which means anyone is allowed to access this space, and you would have no defense if a man walked into a woman's change room.
Do you have an update on the current status of the Vancouver Rape Relief Shelter? Has it lost its existence because it's lost its funding, or is it still functioning on a marginal, in a marginal way?
They are totally still functioning. So the grant that they lost was a grant that they've been getting from the city every single year for many years, but it was a grant that was specific to public funding. So I think it was like $20,000 or something like that. Because what Vancouver Rape Relief does is not only, you know, they don't only support and house victims of abuse, they also do a lot of public education around violence against women and around feminism. So they put on really great events every year, and they do a lot of outreach. So that was the funding that they lost. So they still have their funding to actually run the transition house and to do their other work with victims of rape and domestic violence.
And they've been able to hold the line at keeping it a women-only facility.
They have, yeah. Like I said, they won that right through this case back in 2007 when Kimberly Nixon filed a human rights complaint because he wasn't allowed to train as a counselor there. And they won the right to define their own membership in the collective and to, you know, make decisions for themselves about who is allowed into the transition house. So it isn't even, again, specific to women, but they do have that right. They're going to continue to have to fight this forever.